asking for advice, the Living Languages or RNLD mailing list is a good source. There are lots of other sources, or the Colang websites, many online sources of information, tutorials for Flex and tutorials for Elan as well. But it's also important to recognize that you may not want to do something, you may not want to learn some computational trick, but you know somebody that can do it. So it's recognizing when a task that you are undertaking is not being done efficiently. That is, you're doing something that could take you 2 weeks and you can get someone else to do it in a few minutes. So ideally, you could learn how to do it, or else prevail on somebody else who can do it to do it for you in a few minutes. So we want to talk about well-formed data, and well-formed data is data that can endure into the future and is reusable. So the characteristics of this kind of data are that it's well-structured, and we separate the content and the form, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The media that we record should all be in standard and archival formats. So separating content and form, a good example that we would all be familiar with if we've ever used Toolbox is the Toolbox stores data in this / format, and what it's doing there is specifying what the content of the document is. And it's saying that this part of the document, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the LX marks the head word, PS marks the noun, and so on. And so having all of this well structured means that you can create something that looks like the dictionary entry in the bottom right from this, but the dictionary entry in the bottom right is just a presentation of well structured data. And this is the theme for the day. So excellent data without too much extra work, and endure and be accessible. So endure, what does that mean? It's really important in language documentation that we think of storing our data for posterity. That is, there's no point doing language documentation if it ends up on your computer and then disappearing when your computer crashes. So we need to think about how to make the data that we record last. And that includes thinking about the formats that we use. They have to have longevity and not be tied up in some proprietary system that belongs to a company and then will be lost when that company goes out of business. The data has to be accessible. And to do this, we have to describe it using standard terms. So describe it in a way that can be searched by other people. And to do that, it has to have some persistent identification. That means you need to be able to cite it in a way that it will still be citable in the next 5 and 10, 100 years. And obviously that requires some sort of archive to keep those persistent identifiers alive. And you also have to have permission to use it. And this is where you need, this is different in different countries. And I know that we've got people online now from a number of different countries. So it's going to be different in particular places, but we need to have informed consent from people we work with, and we need to have that in some form, recorded, written, but we need people's consent, otherwise it's very difficult then to archive that material and make it available to others. And making this available in various forms, again, requires this to be done automatically. We need the data that we have to be able to be converted into other forms automatically. So if you've used Toolbox or Flex, you know that you can output a phone app or a website or a paper dictionary from the same data source. And this is the sort of thing that we want to be able to do. And similarly with Elan, you can output the material that you create in Elan in various formats, including subtitles, and then obviously citing particular chunks of your recordings in your written work, in your thesis or in your papers. Part of the rationale for all of this is that others can use our material and continue to use it into the future. So we want this material to be used by other researchers and also by obviously community members who want to produce materials in their own languages. The tools that we need to use shouldn't lock our data into proprietary formats. So proprietary formats are, for example, Microsoft formats. putting things into Microsoft databases, spreadsheets, documents, risks them being inaccessible in the future. Now, more recent versions of Microsoft use docx and these sorts of formats, which are a bit more accessible than the previous ones were. But if you've ever tried to open versions of Microsoft Word documents from 10 years ago, you know that that can be a real problem. So here's a schematic workflow. I apologize if you've seen this before. It's one that I've used many times, but just to give you a sort of schematic of the way that I see these things fitting together. So when you start, obviously there's a lot of project planning. I'm not saying that you just leap into recording straight away, but there's a little gap there, as you can see. But when you do get started, you do your recording and you name that recording. So the naming immediately becomes an issue. Right from the start, you have to think about what name you're giving to your files. And then you create a digital file which you capture somewhere else. So you can capture that to your laptop, you put it onto a hard disk, and you put it in other places, and then you add some descriptive metadata. And that descriptive metadata you can write into a spreadsheet. You can use the tool Meta that we'll look at, or Saymore, which is an SIL product which runs on Windows. These are good ways of adding your descriptive metadata. And then you create an archival digital file, which is high resolution and has the metadata, and then you can archive those files. You can then transcribe those files, linking them, that is doing time-aligned transcription, as we'll see in the next session using Elan. And that builds a media corpus. And you can archive your Elan transcripts at that point as well. So you can see that archiving is part of the process right from the start. It's not something that happens at the end of your research. It's something that you build into your research as you go. Your media corpus is a list of all of your transcripts and your media. Elan lets you build this sort of thing, and then you can do things like concordancing your text, that is getting a list of all the words in your text in context. You can navigate through your texts and find the particular examples you want. And then you can output that into Flex, Fieldworks, for interlinearizing and lexicon building up your text and a textual database with interlinearizing, with free glossing, free translations, and building a dictionary. And all of that also then gets archived. Now, of course, this is very simplistic, but it does give a sense of how the tools fit together. So we want to think about three forms of our data. That is a working form, an archival form, and a presentation form. So the working form is the form in which you store your data and the way it's created and edited. And this can include notes and all kinds of extra information that you have on your computer. So in Elan, you'll get these extra files, PFSX. Toolbox has type files and project files. So these are all extra things that are in the working form of the data. The working form then becomes an archival form, which is that you take the highest resolution of your form of your data and put that into the archive. So we'll look at what that means further. But you don't want to put everything into the archive. You want to sort out from your working collection of material which of that then has to be archived. And then you can create the presentation form. So this is derived from the well-formed data. So you derive the presentation form, as we saw with the dictionary, from well-structured underlying data. And you can make it compressed. You can make it in Microsoft Word or PDF or whatever you like, because it's essentially disposable, right? This is a form that you'll put somewhere, people will use it, and eventually, you may supersede that with an updated version. But it can be compressed for delivery on the web, so you don't want high resolution audio being delivered on the web because it takes up a lot of bandwidth. So presentation forms are derived from good archival forms. Now, the problem with the workflow that we just looked at is that you need to be able to allow your data to flow through the various tools. And one of the problems that we have is that some tools don't allow you to import and export your data easily, and not in the formats that the next tool needs. So thinking about the tools isn't the way really to think about the workflow. It's to think about what processes there are in the workflow, and that a new tool may arise which lets you do something and you can throw away one of the other tools. And we've seen this recently with Toolbox. It's no longer really the tool that should be used for doing interlinearizing and dictionary building. You should now be using Flex. So it's important to understand how each of the tools works, what they do to the data, and how you may be able to do those same processes better when some new tool appears. Okay, and I think, you know, so the idea of lossless conversion, so when you take your primary data, so video is a good example, when you capture that off a camera, you've got to try and do that in a way which loses as little as possible of the signal that you have on the camera. So whenever you do a conversion of your data, you should think about what kind of loss there may be. So if you convert a Microsoft Word document, for example, which has rich formatting all the way through it, to text, you've lost all the formatting. And some of that formatting may be telling you something about the components of that file, and you've lost that if you convert it to text. So think about when you're converting documents or converting files, not losing what's in there. So compressing a WAV file, for example, loses a lot of the signal and makes the signal less useful for future reuse. But derived views of the primary data can be compressed. So you can compress a video file down and you can have subtitled videos that don't have interlinear glosses. So you may have interlinearized text, but you will just extract the text line to put into your subtitles, or the text line and the translation to put into your subtitles. So the presentation view is derived and may be much thinner than the archival view. Now, file naming is extremely important, and you know, as I work in Paradisec and see many different file names being presented to us, I think it's very important for you to think about what you're naming and how you're naming it. You have to think, so the collector, that is the person doing the recording, has to think of what are the objects that you're going to archive, and what do you need to name. So typically in the old days we had tapes, nowadays it's files, but you also have transcripts, you have text, you'll have images, you'll have videos, all kinds of files that all need to be named. So thinking of file naming, there are lots of websites with advice on file naming. You should probably talk to the archive that you want to work with before you start your fieldwork to see what their file naming conventions are, and to make sure that your names will conform with theirs. In the end, it's really about being fairly simple with file naming and not having too long file names, because in some computer systems there are limits on the number of characters you can have in a file name. So a simple way of naming a file could be to use a year and then a number like this. And then in our Paradisec system, that would have a collection identifier before it, and then it would get split up in this way. Now you can do things like this, and people do, where you include a language code, a date, a place, a person, and the gender of the person, for example. And some people want to do this. I would discourage it, but if that's what you're doing, it's up to you. The problem with this kind of naming is that you may end up with more than one language or more than one speaker, and then how do you deal with that? And your names can become quite long. So I would urge, rather than doing that, to keep it simple and to use the metadata to encode the meaning of what's inside a file and the information like that. So persistent identification means that you don't ever change that file name. Even if it gets an extra bit added onto it when it goes into an archive, you can still resolve to that name because the name you've given it is still there within the name the archive gives it. I've got a reference there to the Paradisec file naming convention, but you can find these online. In the chapter that I wrote with Andrew Perez, the reference is there and it's available online. We talk about file naming quite a bit, and you should look at that if you're interested. One of the issues is the various devices we use assign names to the files. So digital recorder typically gives you a name like STE001, or your camera produces images with names like image.0086. These names are not unique. Usually they get put into a folder, and the next month there's a new folder which has the same file name in it. So you risk not being able to identify these files unless you take note immediately in your notebook, in your field notes, of what the file name is and what's in it. So you take the basic metadata, that is who's in the photo, what the date is, where you are, and then as soon as you capture that file to your computer, you change its name. So you change it to something more meaningful, and then you never change it again. So because we're dealing with a lot of data, and a lot of data means more than a few hours of material, we need to be able to automate as much as possible of our workflow. So this means that you need to be able to find things, you need to be able to keep track of everything that you've worked with and recorded. So the sort of metadata you need to capture right at the moment of your making your recording. So if you're in the field, you would keep track of the date created, the place, however you're doing that. If you want to use lat long, latitude and longitude, or you could use place names. People involved and what their roles are. So who's the speaker? Is there someone singing? Who's the recorder? Is it a text? Is it a sound? Is it a sound recording? And so on. And again, existing archives have metadata systems, but you can add your own metadata relevant to your particular context. The important thing for a computer is that it needs to have consistent data. So it's no good looking for a person's name if you've recorded it in 4 different ways. So sometimes you recorded it with initials, sometimes you recorded it with one spelling, sometimes another spelling, sometimes you put their first name first, sometimes you put their last name first. So try and think a bit like a computer and be consistent. When you write dates, think of standard ways of writing dates, and there are 2 there that you could consider. And we know that there's an American way of writing dates and a European way of writing dates, and we want it to be consistent. Now, a database can help you enforce consistency, but we don't have a simple database. This is something that we're thinking about with Lameta. But if you know about databases, you can create your own database to enforce this consistency through using drop-down menus and keeping ensuring the consistency of your data. Yep, so I think we've talked about that. So one of the principles is that we want to be able to reuse our primary data, and we want to be able to reuse our derived analysis. So the derived analysis includes the transcription, it includes the interlinearization and so on. But it is a fundamental principle of all of this methodology that we should be able to reuse our material. And I have seen a number of examples of people who come to Paradisic, for example, a few years after they've deposited material and then have to retrieve it from Paradisic because their machine has, their computer's crashed and they don't have any copies of their own. Or they simply can't find it because of the way that they've organized or not organized their collection. So in many cases, it's only at the moment of depositing in Paradisic that people actually organize their collections. Otherwise, they've typically got a bunch of files sitting on their computer. You don't want to leave this until you're about to retire. You won't do it. Or if you do, it's going to take you a very long time. It's much easier to do this and to build it into your workflow while you're doing the recording, while you're doing the field work, and while you're doing the analysis, because it's fresh in your mind. You've got a lot of head notes as well as field notes, and you should put those down into some spreadsheet, which can then be archived. So when you plan your fieldwork, you'll need to consider things like what kind of information you're going to be recording. So obviously you need to take notes. I'm not suggesting that everything is done on a computer. You still need to take notes on paper, most likely, while you're in the field. Will you be recording audio and video? Think about the kinds of camera that you might need. Think about the tripod that you need to take with you. Are you going to target multi-participant conversations, in which case you might need more microphones or more recording devices? If you're recording songs, you'll need better equipment than if you're recording narratives. So all of this needs to be part of your planning. If you're doing work on place names, obviously a GPS of some kind is important. If you're working on genealogies, you may need to think of genealogical software. So all of these are part of the sort of the planning for what you're doing. But at each point, the same issues arise. Is this software going to let me enter my data and get it out in some standard format that I can reuse? So if I use a genealogical, some genealogical software that is to, track relationships between people I'm working with, can I get that data out in some interchange format? What is the interchange format for genealogies? Well, it's GEDCOM, and can I get it out in GEDCOM? But finding out what those interchange formats are and how I can get my data into them is really the major issue. And same with video recorders. Each of them has their own raw format. How do I convert from that format into a format that can be used by the software that I use and then archived? So think about the kinds of equipment you need. Think about backups, hard disks. Think about maybe small USB sticks that you can send back from the field so you can archive your recordings from the field. But get advice and research the equipment. This sort of thing is changing all the time. Better equipment is coming out all the time. So it's really good to share this kind of information with others who are doing this same work. As I said, consent forms are important for us here and in some other countries. We have to do this. Our university makes us do this. And I think it's a good thing that we have to make it clear to the people we work with what we want to do with their recordings and have their permission to do that. It's important to learn to use your equipment before you go into the field. Try it out in different conditions. Try it out in places where there's some background noise, where there's wind, and see how you can avoid some of those background noise problems when you're making your recordings. So writing notes is still very important. Using a waterproof pen can be a really important thing to think about if you're in the tropics or in places where it's likely to get wet. When you make a recording, you can speak into the recording at the beginning and say who is on the recording when you're recording it. So you've got that metadata on the recording itself. So if the recordings are ever separated from the metadata, you can still recover what the recording is from that initial piece of metadata that you've spoken onto it. When you've written your field notes into a notebook, you may want to keyboard them so that you can then search them, or you can scan them. I've scanned all my notes and put them into the archive as well. Obviously nowadays we're using laptops and portable devices, but that adds an element of risk, as we know. So you want to be sure that you've got good backups for all of that, all of what you've recorded in the field. Now, there are some very good tools for doing metadata entry and file management. Saymore is a tool produced by Summer Institute of Linguistics, and Lameta is a new version of that a group of us, so this is ELDP, our Centre of Excellence here in Australia, and the University of Hawaii have cooperated on using National Science Foundation funding to produce Lameta. So Saymore lets you put together, so Saymore is virtually the same as Lameta, but Lameta has some different functionality and is cross-platform. What these tools let you do is point the tool at a bunch of files, and then, as you can see here, you can add metadata about those files. You can see thumbnails or see the video, so you can add the metadata to those files. They let you add person information. So you can have information for each of the people that you work with, and you can also include their consent form there and a photo, as you can see. It also lets you bundle these files together into sessions, which are usually the way that archives organize their collections. So you have all of these files here, you can see all making up one particular session, and you can have metadata for all the files, and you can have metadata for the sessions as well. So Lameta is the version of this that we've created most recently. So this is available. It's a beta version, that is, it's being developed as during this year. We are looking for feedback. So I'd encourage you to try it, but be aware that it's beta, so that you know, you save things periodically. But it is something that we want to build for the whole community of people doing language documentation. So I'd really encourage you to look at it. I'm going to show it to you now, but I'll just, before I do that, I'll stop screen sharing, and if I can. Okay, and open up for quick questions, if there are any, while I organize Lameta. So if you've got any questions, you can ask now.
Nick, I've got a question. It's Lee Brown here.
Hello.
Hi. What is the what program? Excuse me. What's the program that is used with Flex and Elan for writing? I mean, it's not Microsoft Word. Is there some other whatever the orthography is what? How is it?
I'm sorry, could you reframe the question? I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, so when you're entering data with Flex and Microsoft Word, is it a different program? Sorry, not Microsoft Word, with Flex and Elan. Is it a different program from Microsoft Word? I mean, it's not using Microsoft Word to, is it?
That's right. So Flex is its own program, and it has its own system, so it can import, Rosie will show you this later, but you can import and export a number of different formats in Flex, including you can open those in Microsoft Word, but it's using you know, its own internal, it's got a database inside it, it imports various formats and it exports various formats. Same with Elan, it's just text underneath. You can export it in various formats, and you can open those in whatever you want, including Microsoft Word.
Okay, good, thanks.
Hi, Nick.
Hello.
Hi, this is Dorothy. I'm joining from the US.
Hi.
I'd like to find out if for Lameta and Seymour you have the Mac iOS version. Do you have a Mac version?
Yes. So Lameta runs on Mac.
Okay.
But Seymour does not, and that's why we organised why we had Lameta written was because Seymour was only for Mac, and a lot of people were having trouble. You can run Seymour on the Mac with emulation using Parallels or something like that, but Lameta is cross-platform.
Hi, thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'm trying to share my video, but it's not working for some reason. Ah, there it is. So I was wondering about file naming strategies. So what I've been using, I know a lot of people use dates, speakers, and so on. But what I've been using is a code, let's say 001, and then underscore, and then a keyword that can be anything. It can be the speaker, but it can be, let's say, what the story is about, or what the recording is about. Let's say if it's a song, or even the location where I recorded it, because it might be, because I'm writing this keyword mostly for myself, so I can remember what this recording is of. So what could be the potential problems with such a naming strategy?
Look, you know, if it works for you and you've got, you know, your file names aren't too long and you don't have, so one of the things I didn't mention, I think, is not including spaces in file names, trying not to use non-ASCII characters. Unfortunately, that's still a problem. But otherwise, you know, if it works for you, that's good. But, you know, the sort of examples I gave, if you have a very strict file naming convention and then you have files that don't conform, so for example, using one language code, but you actually end up having 3 languages in the recording, how do you deal with that? So you don't want to prefigure your naming convention in a way that stops it being useful for things that you know, situations that you may encounter. Any other questions? We will have time. Yeah, sorry.
Nick, Ruben here. Just wondering if you could, just before we move on from the workflow discussion, just touch on the idea too of archiving some materials as you go in some kind of repository as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an important issue. So we have had situations where people are in the field. So one particular example was a field worker in the northern Philippines. It was actually quite a dangerous field site and she had to keep moving her field site. She was sending DVDs of her data back to us for archiving, and she felt much better because she knew that she wasn't carrying around all her data with her, with potential that it could be stolen, damaged, lost, whatever. But that required her, before she left, being in touch with us and determining good file naming conventions for her files so that she was using those file naming conventions in the field, putting them on the file, sending them to us, and then she was able to cite them. So immediately she was able to use those names in her research in the field, and then she was, you know, that was a good way to do it. So I would really encourage you to think about archiving your data either from the field or as soon as you get back from the field as possible. But you also have to consider, you don't want to archive everything. So you need to be making good decisions along the way about, you know, some files just mightn't be worth archiving. You don't have to archive everything. Okay, look, I think I'll switch now and just show you Lametta. Okay, so we're now screen sharing, yes? Can you see that? Can you see Lametta there?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So when you open Lametta, you get this. So as I said, Lametta is cross-platform. It's a beta version. So I would encourage you to give us feedback. But what you can do is, see, I'm not sure if I have a project open already. Sorry. I think what I'll do is create a new project. And I'll call it 2020 session. So this is me creating a new Lametta project.
So spaces are okay here?
Just in the name of the project ID, it's okay, yeah. Yeah. But, and then the content language, you can put in a code if you know it. It will use the ISO 6393 codes, or you can put in a name. So I will put in the name Nasan, and the code is ERK. You can choose between the content language and the working language. There are a lot of details in this. You can put in the region, put in, and then the country, and so on. As you can see, there's a lot of detail. This is at the highest level, and then we can go from here, and we can put in information about the access protocol. This uses access protocols from a number of different archives. So you can select the archive that you want to deposit in, and then it will apply those conditions that the archive has supplied in the collection that you're building. You can put in other description documents if you want. If you want, you could put grant applications here. And then you can add sessions and you can add people. So if we go to sessions and we add a new session, what we can do is grab some photos. We can drag the photos over here. And you can see, I mean, what's nice about this now is that, pardon me, we've got the photos, we can see the photos in the viewer. We can add information about those photos. We can add the name of the person. We can say that they're the photographer. So you can see there's a controlled vocabulary there of people's roles. And we can also add people. Now, at the moment, the person that we just entered doesn't get put into the people. So that's one of the things that we need to change. But we can put that, we can put other people in here. You can put in their birth year. Whatever their languages are, you can add languages to that. So you can see that it's slowly building up collections. If we go back here now and add a person to it, then that person is now available to us to add to the session. So there are features that we need to add to this. So we need to capture more metadata from the files themselves, but that's something that's on the list. What you can then do with this is export this project in various forms. So you can see that the forms given here are CSV, IMDI, which is the form for the language archive, and Nijmegen. And you can select sessions. So if you've marked sessions in your data set, you can select which of those sessions you want to export. And again, we're going to add different export options here for different archives. So we'll have a paradisic export and so on for different participating archives. So that's a free tool. It's available for you to download and use. And I'd encourage you to try it and to get back with us with any suggestions for improvements. It's also open source, so we have it on GitHub, and programmers are encouraged to get in and work on it. It's in JavaScript. So let me unmute you again. And now I think I've covered a lot in a very short time, and I'm happy to take any questions now for the next 15 minutes or so.
Nick?
Yep.
This is Hannah calling from Darwin. Sorry, it's coming up on the screen as Janos, my colleague. I work for Yulunga Radio at ARDS, and I'm working in a team across a couple of locations, and there are, it's obviously fairly large, as you would call it, collection with radio material and so on. Our only tool for metadata at the moment is a SharePoint site that has been created especially for ARDS, capturing information not so much for archiving but for you know, finding and locating files on a massive server system. Is there any interaction between SharePoint and Lameta?
You could, well, because Lameta exports in CSV, which is comma separated values, it's just a text file.
Yeah.
In principle, it should be able to be imported into a spreadsheet. If whatever, I don't know exactly what your SharePoint data structure is. Is it a spreadsheet?
Yeah, basically, and I have exported to CSV before. So Lameta does import CSV somehow. I guess you'd have to give it instructions, wouldn't you, to separate it into sessions and projects and stuff.
That's right. So that's the difference, I think, is that that sort of conceptual structure of the collection in Lameta is projects and sessions. And it sounds like you've got a flat structure in your SharePoint, which is
that's correct.
Items. Yeah. But what you could do in Lameta is just have a single session which has all the items in it, and then that would then, I think, you know, fit into what you're doing. So one of the big problems I know many people have with image collections is exactly how do you describe image collections? You know, it's very tricky. If you've got a bunch of images and you've got a spreadsheet, it's the disconnect between the spreadsheet and the images, and you've got to be sure you've got the right names. Whereas the good thing about Lameta is you're looking at the image, you can type in the description of it and move on to the next image. And also, you know, if you have a bunch of images of the same thing, you can apply the same metadata to a bunch of images. So I think there is an advantage to using something like Lameta, but you do have to maybe do a few, create a few items and then see how that export works between Lameta and your SharePoint spreadsheet before you commit a lot of time to Lameta.
Thank you.
Can I just ask if you can import MD files into Lameta?
I'm not sure about that because MD files can be quite convoluted. You can export from Lameta into MD, but that's because, you know, you're providing a particular data structure that goes into MD. I'm not sure that you can. In fact, I'll just have a look here. I don't think you can. No. No. And I don't think that we have at the moment a way of importing anything except SAMOR, very basic SAMOR files into Lameta. It's really made for creating collections rather than taking metadata from other systems. But again, that's a feature that, you know, could be put on the wish list if it's something that enough people want. If you haven't already signed up to the course, could you please do that? There's a sign up link at the top of the chat. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have one, Nick. Where's the chat?
Okay, where's the chat?
The little orange box at the bottom?
I'm not sure where it is on your window. Yes, I tried a little orange box. I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
It's gone away. Somehow it's gone away.
Right.
But the screen that I'm seeing, which I think is your screen, it's very small letters at the moment, and I can't see if there's anything at the top of that.
Right. Let me see here. So somebody's just posted there. So James just posted. This is this. I'll just post the sign up sheet again and see if you can see if there's anything flashing on your screen when I do this. I've just posted the link to the sign up sheet again.
Everyone?
Yeah.
Everyone.
Yeah, okay, I can see that.
Good, okay. Well, and the other link that was there was the link to install Elan.
Uh-huh.
In fact, Elan very helpfully created a new version 2 days ago. So
yes.
you can download the latest version there. Okay.
Sorry, Nick, I did have one more question. It's Hannah.
Mm-hmm.
Apologies if I've missed something in the presentation. I've used Seymour before quite a lot and seen the potential for the metadata recording with the project session people structure, but never really used it. I've just enjoyed the basic, you know, transcription, translation format that it contains. It's a really nice, neat, tidy program. With Lameta, are you actually importing audio files into it or not? I'm still not clear that whether you're actually importing audio or video into it, because you did show me one slideshow that has that stuff in it, and clearly the pictures are there or a thumbnail of the pictures there. Is it the same with the audio and the video or not? No. Sorry if I've missed something.
No, that's a good question. So Seymour lets you do transcription and has a whole function which is very similar to Elan, but that's we haven't included that in Lameta. So Lameta doesn't have the transcription function. It's really just a collection, description, collection creation tool. So no, Lameta doesn't let you do transcription of audio, but if you want to do that, Seymour is a very good tool for doing that, but only on Windows.
Sure, but the audio file isn't contained in Lameta at all, just the reference to it.
Yeah, in fact, none of the files are contained in Lameta, just the references are contained in Lameta. So when you go to a session and see a file, what you're getting is a view of the file, but the file itself is stored in its original location.
Okay, and so you get a view of audio. Sorry, just because your example is images only.
Yeah.
If you had shown us an example of an audio file, would you see a little view of that, or a video file? Would you see a little view of that?
Yeah.
Yes, that's my question.
Find a WAV file and show you how it comes up.
Yeah, thank you. That would be. I mean, I can investigate all this too when I have a try. But.
It does have a layer. So yes, you can.
Great. Oh, that's great. Thank you. That answers the question. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, are there any other questions?
Just in follow-up to that, Nick, that's a huge advantage over SharePoint right there, because for our team members, it's horrible having any kind of database and system that's completely divorced from the server and where the files actually are.
Yes.
So yeah. if you're building that in to Lameta, that's streets ahead of SharePoint and any other database that I've seen.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Okay, so you can see the video now.
Mm.
So all of these tools like Elan as well, they can play media depending on your machine and what sort of codecs your machine has. They should be able to play most common media formats, but there might be some that they can't. But nevertheless, you can see here, this is an MP4 file, however that's been encoded, and it plays it fine. And I agree with you. I think this is one of the really important things, is that you should be able to see the object that you're describing and not get confused. Because one of the problems is if you have a bunch of image files on your computer and a bunch of videos and you're writing a spreadsheet, is maintaining in your own mind what the relationship is between the thing that you're looking at and where it goes in the spreadsheet. And that's opened to a lot of error. Where you get slippage, you may be putting the metadata in for the wrong file name and so on. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to build this particular version of Seymour that made it more accessible to a cross-platform for collection building. you can, as one of the exports, you can opt to include the files. So in this case, it's using MD as the metadata, but what this will do is it will bundle all the files and the metadata together to create what's called a submission information package, which is really just a bundle of files and metadata that you can give to an archive. So this is also very useful potentially. I mean, obviously it creates a very big file, but it's something that Lameta also lets you do.
Thank you, that's great. I think this is my last question. It's Han again. I'm sorry.
Yep.
This is about sharing this information in Teams online. Is there a syncing send receive function that can mean that, you know, other members of my team are working on the same project or sessions, or how does that work? Is there any pathway for that?
No, I don't think there is. I think,
oh.
I think you have to, well, yeah, I mean, yes, I think as far as I know, and I haven't tried it, in fact, Susan Kung, are you there? I thought Susan's also been involved in testing this, and I thought she might have an answer to this. I'm pretty sure that you cannot share this. You'd have to have people working on it, you know, sending the Lameta file to somebody and they can work on it on their collection and then send it back to you, but it doesn't work as a shared online tool. Again, something that, you know, could go into the wish list, but it's not there.
Thank you.
It seems to still be quite a problem that we don't have good software for describing collections. And this is not just for linguistics, this is for small art centres, cultural centres, museums. They're still struggling with how to describe collections of materials that they have. And, you know, spreadsheets are okay, but they don't, in the end, really cut it. They work fine and they're better than nothing. But a good database with, you know, controlled vocabulary so that every time you enter a person's name, it's in the same form. Every time you enter a place name, it's in the same form, is what we need. And there don't seem to be generic tools openly available at the moment, unfortunately. But again, I'd be really happy to hear if any of you has experience with a tool like that. Okay, look, I think what we'll do now is take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back and look at Elan. And so we'll work through Elan. I hope you've got Elan loaded. If you don't, please load it so that you can follow along if you want. And let's do that. So I'll see you back here in 15 minutes.